Nate, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Tim, always good to be here.
Well, we had you and David on REI Real Estate Investing episode 132. We talked about rent versus buy, not a new conversation, but one that is relevant in today's market and how today's market might shift that conversation a little bit. We'll link to that episode in the show notes in case folks missed that. But today we're talking about what to look for when hiring a real estate agent. And similar to our last episode, while we've touched on this periodically, there are some new things in the market related to buyer's agreements and other things that we need to talk about that really are shifting this conversation a bit. So we're going to do that. But first, let's get your take, Nate, on kind of what's happening in the housing market in 2025. If anyone's been watching the news on this, existing home sales, fell again last year to lowest level since 1995. Interest rates continuing to stay pretty high where they've been. And people like you and I are saying, hey, there ain't no way we're moving and we're not giving up the interest rate we've had. All of that contributing to what appears to be an ongoing challenging market for first-time home buyers, right?
Yeah, a lot going on just in the last 12 months and even in the short term, just in the last couple of weeks. I'll say all of this with the caveat that all real estate is local, right? So I might give a global trend or a local insight into Cleveland, Ohio market that doesn't apply to you, right? Because it's all going to be specific to your locale. So that's important to keep in mind, that none of this stuff applies globally everywhere. It's just sort of what we're seeing in terms of trended data. So as you mentioned, we did see existing home sales fall last year. And a lot of that, analysts feel like, was because of the rising interest rates. It reduced the amount of affordability that was out there. If your interest rate goes up, that means your monthly payment goes up, which means you can't afford as much house, which means, hey, if I need a 4-bedroom because my family size is X and now I'm priced out of a 4-bedroom, like my only choice might be to rent now, right?
Yeah.
So we saw a lot of that. The other thing, like you said so astutely, is just we're not moving, right? If you've got a sub 4% rate and you go to sell that property, your only option is to then go buy something that is either cash or above 7.5%, right? Depending on the time that you were buying. So a lot of people felt like, whoa, I'm just going to put the brakes on moving and I'm just going to stay where I'm at. And so those existing homes kind of just sat there and didn't move as much.
Yeah, and I think what you're seeing, Nate, which both you and I can attest to in our own situations, and the pandemic really spurred this, but it's continued, is people saying, hey, I'm not going to move. Maybe I was considering that. I'm not going to move, but I'm going to make improvements and updates to our house. We finished our basement this past year. We had talked about moving a year or so ago and decided, you know what, interest rates are what they are, and we had a much lower rate. Mathematically doesn't make sense. Let's kind of focus on some improvements on the house. And just before we hit record, I heard the hammer in the background, right, on your house. So you're doing something similar.
Yeah, we basically have been talking about this for years, and kind of within the last year, my wife and I sat down and said, look, I think this is it. I don't think we're moving. We're pretty locked into this house. We love our location. We love where the kids are at. We love access we have to all the amenities we have here in our particular spot. And so we said, let's put on the sunroom we've always talked about doing. Like, let's be here. And so, like you said, if we wanted this exact property somewhere else, it'd be really hard to find, and two, we'd pay an absolute ton for it somewhere else. So just make the improvements we want here and enjoy it while we're here.
Yeah. Great stuff. Well, today's topic, what to look for when hiring an agent. Again, not a new topic, but is updated information that we have to talk about. And we're going to get more in the weeds on this, but really the piece here that's new is the implementation of a buyer's agent agreement. So Nate, at a high level, kind of tell us why this new wrinkle has thrown a new factor into the equation for people to think about when they're looking at hiring an agent.
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep yet. Let's dive in as we kind of get through the pieces. But to set the 10,000-foot stage, there was a settlement last year. We had an episode on this, actually. The NAR settled on a lawsuit that was pending. They basically said, we want buyer representation to be very transparent. By that extension, or because of that ruling, the National Association of Realtors said, okay, before you work with a buyer's agent, you have to have a contract in place that says what that buyer's agent is going to be paid. And that compensation is going to be provided in a very clear, laid out fashion. Again, we'll go through some of the specifics, but in most cases, what those terms of those agreements say is that the buyer is agreeing to pay their agent Typically, they're going to try to get that amount from the seller as a
Yep.
contingency of purchasing the home. But technically, the buyer is on the hook, and they've sort of always been on the hook. But this is really laying it out to say, look, before we start working together, this is the contract you have to sign that says how much I'm going to get paid. And that's a very big difference from where it was years and years ago.
Yeah, and as you and I were planning for this episode, we said, hey, these pieces now really raise the bar for this decision of hiring an agent. I mean, it's always been important, but now we're talking about signed agreements needing to be in place, potentially financial implications on the buy side if we can't get the seller to take care of it. And let's not forget, no offense to the real estate agents that are out there, but Nate, it's a low bar of entry, right, into the field. And because of that, not all agents are created equal. And we're talking about what that means, but all the more reason that on the buy side, we've got to be doing our homework. And first-time home buyers, inevitably, you're excited about the home, you're looking, and this is where it's like, hey, Aunt Susie's third cousin's neighbor is a good agent. You should work with them. And I remember being a first-time home buyer. We kind of run in that direction. That's how I got connected to our agent, which thankfully worked out, but it wasn't the best homework that we did in that process. So all the reasons we'll get into it during the episode of, hey, as the buyer, what responsibilities do you have in looking for an agent? What are some of those things that you should be looking for to make sure you got someone in your corner that's really going to help you through this process?
Yep.
So let's start there, Nate. As I mentioned, not all agents are created equal. So if that's the case, what are some of the key qualities or traits that home buyers should be looking for when hiring an agent?
Yeah, I think you could go down a bunch of different paths here. I think to start, where I would recommend is know what your goal is and know what your specific kind of target is, right? So let me explain. If I am an investor buying an investment property, that's a very different agent. If I am looking for a farm with 100 acres and a 10 horse stall, like that's a different agent. If I'm looking for an apartment in New York City, like that's a different type of agent, right? So first start with what your goals are. Like if it's just single family home in the suburbs, you have a much broader pool of people to be looking at. If you are looking for a specialized target, like that narrows your pool of options as kind of a first step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that to your point, right? If someone's looking at a commercial property versus a residential, is this an investment property that they're thinking about doing Airbnb? And does that agent understand some of the local rules and regulations, right? So start with the vision, start with the goal. And then from there, what else are we thinking about on more of a micro level?
Yeah, so that's where I would recommend you go out and you do kind of a background Google search, right? Or you've got great access to online information about these agents. You can get a good feel for something like transaction volume. You can figure out if they're on a team. If you look up their Zillow profile, their Realtor.com profile, you can see like, is it just Nate working as an agent by himself, or does Nate have a team of people that I might be working with? And there are pros and cons to that. But if you set aside and you're like, no, I want my guy or gal and I only want to work with that person and that's the way I want to operate, like you can do that background research without ever having to interview an agent that's on a team or vice versa, right? You want someone that's available all the time. Great. If you have a team of people, then you're always guaranteeing somebody's around. So you can do a lot of that background research to see things like that. I also encourage people to look at agents' Facebook posts, their Instagram. I personally am kind of terrible about being on social media, but you can get a pretty good feel for an agent's style, their personality, how they list a property. A lot of agents will have walkthrough videos of their listings, and you can feel out that person without ever having to interact with them, which is nice, right? You can just kind of start that book from the very beginning without having to make a bunch of extra phone calls, interview a bunch of extra agents. You can weed people right out over the internet.
Yeah, and I was half joking about the referral, right? I mean, your referrals matter, and if people have a good experience, that's great. But what I'm encouraging people to do is not stop there, right? And what other information can we gather about that agent to understand, whether or not they're a good fit? Nate, in our industry, in the financial planning industry, for a firm like ours that's regulated by the SEC, a lot of this information is publicly available that people can look up. If they want to read pages and pages of documents, they can read up forms that we have to publish in terms of services that we offer and fees that we have. And if there's things like marks against or complaints against a firm or an advisor, you can get to that information as well. Is there something similar that's out there, or what do these sources look like in terms of checking an agent's experience and history?
Yes and no. a good agent will have a good review system somewhere, right? They'll have either on their website or on Google reviews, Realtor.com, Zillow reviews. One of those, hopefully, if they're a seasoned agent, is going to have some sort of review system where you can look at their actual reviews of their service, right? And if they've got 20 people in the last year that have bought and sold a home and went on and left a glowing recommendation on Google, like that's a better indicator than if you don't have anything out there, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of one. You could also go to the National Association of Realtors website. You can actually dial down by your state. So like we have the Ohio Realtors Board, and you can see if there's been a complaint lodged against that particular agent or whatever. It's pretty rare to have that and have that agent be actively practicing, but it might be worth looking up.
Yeah.
And then ultimately you can just Google that individual, see if something's come up, especially in like the higher profile cases. You might see something where there's an article published about somebody that maybe it's, good or bad, and you can kind of get a good feel for that. So while there's no national database that you can easily reference, there's a lot of source material out there for you to go after.
One thing you said a little bit earlier too, Nate, which is worth going back here is the importance of understanding the local market. And, as we talked about on the Real Estate Investing 132 show, it's not just the city or even the suburb or the area. It's the markets within the market, right? It's the school districts, it's the neighborhood. So what advice would you have for buyers that are out there to find an agent that really understands their market? Especially like I think about Jess and I, like we're not from Columbus and we're looking for a home. Like I'm really leaning on that agent to help us out.
This is where the actual like agent interview might come into play. So again, you've done this sort of background research, you've narrowed it down. You can see that I have sold a bunch of homes in, this particular city or this particular suburb. So now you're going to add me to your list of potential interview targets. And I think a lot of people get like either overwhelmed or just turned off by this part of like, I have to set up like 3 interviews with 3 agents. Like that sounds like a lot of work. It can absolutely be worthwhile, right?
Yes.
This is a step that is a bit of a pain, but doing it now will make sure that you have a good process throughout. And this is a huge purchase. Like you don't want to get it wrong. So when you get that list, right, you've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 or 4 agents, whatever it might be, actually interview them, ask them questions about the local market. If they're like, yeah, I think there's an apartment going in somewhere, or like, if they're pretty unknowledgeable about the area, it's going to come out pretty quickly. If they understand it inside and out, you're going to be able to hear and understand that right over the phone. So it's something I recommend doing. Ask them questions about the local market, ask them about their experience. You can ask them for references. Say, hey, would you be, if your clients are willing, would you be willing to send me, 3 people you've worked with and their contact info so I can just ask them how you were? Agents should be willing to give you this kind of stuff if their clients will allow it, of course, but they should be willing to give you this kind of stuff to support the fact that they are someone that's good to work with.
Yeah, Nate, just as you were talking, I was thinking about and jotting out some notes of things that just since living here, we've come to understand that I probably could have asked better questions about up front. School districts probably is the obvious one, but like in our neighborhood, we have this notorious issue we're a smaller community. And so where we draw water from, like it's really hard water and it just beats on your appliances. You better be ready for like costs associated with, appliances and soft water tanks and things like that. And everyone in the neighborhood knows it, but the buyer doesn't know it, right? Coming into the neighborhood. I think about some of the HOA types of rules and specifics, and every HOA is different in terms of like, do they actually uphold the rules? Do they not? What does that look like? What are the fees? And that stuff easy to find. Property taxes, like we're on the line of Franklin County, which is where Columbus is, and Pickaway County. Well, if you throw a stone, like and you're in Pickaway County, property taxes are a whole lot different than they are in Franklin County, right? So these are the things. What's the economic development going on in the area? What's the growth and population look like? I mean, so many things that a good agent proactively hope is getting out in front and supporting you in that way.
You could even ask them, I kind of like this question. I've done this before with clients where you can ask the agent, anything going on with city council I should be aware of. And if they look at you like with deer in the headlights, right, that might be a bad sign. They should be involved in the community in some fashion. Now, again, can I be involved in every single community around all of Cleveland where I start? No, but if you're really specifically looking at like, hey, I want to be in Brecksville, Ohio, or, pick a spot, like, then you better know the nuances of that specific location. And what's coming, right? If there's a new trail going in, if they're going to be rebuilding the bridge that you're accessing your house from, right? And you've got to go around an extra 5 miles for the next 2 years. Like, those are the kind of things you really want to have an insight to.
Yeah, Nate is a first-time home buyer. Maybe you can relate to this. If somebody would have told me those things, I've been like, yeah, whatever, it'll be fine, right? But those are the things, like, I think about the metro parks and how we use
Yeah.
the metro park. Like, these things matter day to day in terms of quality of life and how you're interacting with your community. Nate, one other thing I want to ask you about here with this idea of interviewing agents. Love this idea. And I think we should have a similar conversation when it comes to like lenders, interviewing
Mm.
lenders and getting a feel for what's a good fit there. But how about communication? What conversation, what questions can people ask? I know first-time home buyers, right? They're eager, they want responsiveness, what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. How can you guide our listeners as an agent of maybe what buyers should be thinking about or thinking about asking an agent around communication?
Yeah, I think setting a stage of like what is realistic. So what are you looking for, right? If someone came to me and said, "Look, I expect you to be answering a text message within 5 minutes from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m." I'm like, "What? I might not be the agent for you. Like, I'm going to be
Yeah.
with other clients. I have responsibilities. I have kids. Like, I'm going to get back to you in a reasonable amount of time, but this is what it looks like." So I think asking questions, knowing what your expectations are, and just delivering that to the agent and saying, "Hey, here's what I would like. I prefer to communicate via text, or I prefer an email. I really like a weekly phone call to understand where we are." If you can set that up with the agent and they say, "Yeah, that's absolutely reasonable. That works well with me," or "You know what? Like, that's not how I operate." That's how you're going to get good communication. I don't think it's just coming at them and saying, "Do you have good communication skills?" And they're like, "Yes, I do." Because everyone's going to say that. You have to kind of make it a two-way street of like, "Here's how I expect to communicate. How's that going to work?"
Yeah, especially in this market, right? Timely communication, really important. So clear expectations upfront. What specific communication modalities, expectations around hours and timeline of responsiveness, all really important. All right, let's talk about that buyer's agent agreement in more
Mhm.
detail because this is the new wrinkle that, as we talked about at the beginning, really heightens the pressure on the buyer to make sure they have an agent that's the right fit. As you mentioned, the backstory for this, and we'll link to it. It was episode 118 of the Real Estate Investing Podcast that you and David talked about the settlement from the National Association of Realtors. We don't have to get into the whole weeds of that all again. But that really led to this implementation of a buyer's agreement that if anyone's listening and bought a home, let's say what,
Since
8 months
August.
ago or yeah,
Yeah.
since August. So anytime before that, you're like, what buyer's agreement, right? This
Mhm.
wasn't a thing. So tell us a little bit more about what that looks like practically right now. So if I'm a first-time home buyer or prospective first-time home buyer listening and I'm starting to search, what should I expect in terms of these agreements and what the intent is of those agreements?
Yeah, and it's funny, I actually just went through this conversation, earlier this morning, so, like, this is super relevant to what we go through every single day. But essentially, what has changed is that before you can look at homes with a particular agent, they are supposed to have a buyer's agency agreement in place. That basically says, "I am going to be representing you. Here are the terms of that representation. Here are all the things
Mhm.
that I'm gonna do for you. Here is how I'm gonna represent you when I'm talking to other agents. Here's how I'm going to represent you to potential sellers," so on and so forth, right? It lays that all out. For my efforts, my compensation is X. And for the point of this conversation, let's just say it's 3%. Okay.
Yep.
I'm going to make 3% on uh, as a percentage of the home sale. So if the house sells for 500,000, I'm making 3% of that. If it sells for 200,000, I'm making 3% of that,
Yep.
whatever it is. And we're going to establish that that is the amount that I'm going to be compensated. Now, where we get that from is up for negotiation, and that's the big nuance, the big difference from what it used to be. It used to be that the sellers would just offer whatever they were going to offer. When you got a listing agreement in place, you negotiated right then and there with the seller. Hey, it's going to be 2.5 for me, 2.5 for a buyer's agent. And when I would go show a listing, I would know it would actually display it. It would say,
Mhm.
"Nate, if you help a buyer buy this house,
Right.
you're going to get 2.5%." Right? It would list it right there. That is gone. There is no buyer's agreement that's listed or advertised by a seller now. When I go to make an offer, and again, I just did this today with a client, actually last night, and we said, "Look, here's the offer. It's $250,000 and a 3% buyer's agency compensation agreement," right? And so that 3%, we pre-established that that's what I was going to work with the buyer for, and now we're trying to get it from the seller. Interestingly enough, again, since this is happening right here now with
Yeah.
this client that I'm working with, they came back and they said, "Okay, we're going to counter, and we're countering it this slightly higher number than what you've come up with, and we're only willing to pay 2.5% of your buyer's agency
Interesting.
contract." And we said, "Okay, let's talk about that." And so I went back to the buyer and ultimately what we decided was that that's fine. We're going to take 2.5 from the seller, and that 0.5% is actually going to come from my buyer, and they're going to pay that out of their closing costs. But all of it is very transparent. All of it is very negotiated. And that's just how the agreements work now. So you've got to establish that before you ever look at houses, which is just way different than it ever used to be.
So different, right? I mean, days gone by, quick recap, days gone by, seller is going to pay all the fees. So you were expecting as a seller, it's going to cost me 5 or 6%, right? And I'm paying for both the listing agent and I'm paying for the home buyer's fee. It's going to come out of that. So first time for any home buyer, but first time home buyers, especially where we think about money available for things like a down payment, closing costs, things like this, they weren't thinking about this fee.
Right.
On the front end. And so now we have this new piece, which is, hey, we have an agreement up front. It's going to clearly outline what the buyer's agent fee is. That can no longer be on the listing. And the hope is we can negotiate that from the seller. But I'm guessing you can tell us more here in a moment that, hey, there's going to be variances of this. And depending on the market, there may or may not be more pushback, right, from the seller on this. So is this what you're seeing? Like, are you expecting more of this, like what you just had yesterday, where hey, the seller is still going to kind of like days gone by, pay for most of it, but we're going to negotiate a little bit of that. And now we got to put that on the buyer.
Yeah, I think this will be kind of the norm. I think you'll see just more nuance to it of like, let's push back a little bit. Let's adjust this number here. I've had some competitive bids where, there's a lot of bids going into a house and the buyer's compensation that the seller that was being requested kept dropping, right? It's only 1% for this offer. And ultimately, it's all money. Like if we take a step back, right, this was all baked in, even in the old way, it was all baked into the purchase agreement, right? If you were paying a 6% commission on a listing, like that was baked into the price. Now it's just very out in the open and it's part of the negotiation. So it's not like it's actually changed. It's not actually more dollars out of the buyer's pocket necessarily. It's just out in the open and it's a fully negotiated point now.
Yeah. So if we just put some numbers to this, Nate, if we think about a $300,000 home, let's say a typical buyer agent, I know some might be a little bit lower, but let's say a typical buyer agent says, hey, my fee is going to be 3% to you, first time home buyer. So if we get the home for $300,000, that 3% would be $9,000.
Yep.
Now, if we can get that all from the seller, great, nothing out of pocket. But if we can't, let's say the seller, extreme circumstance, says nothing, it's on you. The buyer's got to come up with 9,000. Or if it's a variation, like the one you just gave, 2.5%, most of it would come from the seller, and then a little bit's going to have to come out of pocket from the buyer. Do you think most? I guess we're assuming all agents are following the rules. Let's start there, right?
I hope so. God.
Yeah, but do you think a lot of agents, in the instance you just gave, where the seller says, "Hey, we'll do 2.5%," that's what we're going to negotiate? Do you think most agents are going to hold the line on their 3% fee and put that remaining point on the buyer, or do you think people will start to discount their fees to not have the buyer? Can they do that?
So yeah, I think so. It's well, the can you do it is very broker specific. So if you kind of take one step back, right behind me, that like ultimately I'm representing my broker, right? So they're actually the one that's being paid when we close, and then they give me a chunk of that payment. So that 9,000 or whatever we get, that actually it goes to my brokerage office first. Title office sends it to them, and then I have a contract with my broker for what my compensation from them is. So I can only do so much in terms of like, well, I'll just make it 1%. Like the broker is actually establishing these negotiated fees so that they can run a business, right? It's just part of how that works. Yep. So that's kind of part one. There is some adjustment that can take place. You could absolutely go back and say, you know what, let's renegotiate this. Everybody's drawing a hard line in the sand that says that 0.5% is going to be a deal breaker. Like, okay, maybe we can work this out and waive some of the compensation.
Yeah.
I think the risk there for agents out there that is you could just start to dilute your work down so far that it's not worth doing
to the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a lot of nuance to it. But I do think we'll see this continue where you'll get this kind of negotiation on that 1 to 0.5% piece every single time.
One of the other things we hypothesized when we discussed this back in the summer was, would this or would this not disrupt the traditional way an agent fee is structured, right? So you gave the example of it's a percentage, right? Whether it's a $300,000 home or a $500,000 home, let's say it's 3%. Obviously, that's very different dollars, right? We're talking about $9,000 versus $15,000 in that instance. So we wondered, would we see a transformation to alternative fee structures, flat fee models, some hybrid things that might be out there? Are we seeing that or not yet?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're out there for sure. And we'll even put in like caps and stuff, right? Where it's like, hey, it's
Okay.
3% up to a certain cap, or, there's ways to get around it, and make it more flexible, because you're right. They're, even in the old days, right? So higher end listings, and higher end for Ohio, right? Like in like the 800, $900 million range, that's higher end for Ohio. You would see that fee get diluted, where, okay, it's 3% up to
Got it.
500,000. Then it's 2% on the next 200,000, then 1% after that. So then you would see that fee come down as
Okay.
price points got higher anyway. So yeah, I'm seeing people that are putting caps out there. I'm seeing people that are dropping their percentage based on purchase price.
Mhm.
I'm seeing, I've only seen a few of these, and they're not really taking off, which I think is interesting, where people will do like a flat fee where it's like, hey, look, I am $1,500 to negotiate a contract, and I'm $1,000 per 10 showings, or whatever the number is, right? And
Mm.
you could just agree to that up front. And every time we hit 10 showings, you're going to pay me $2,000 or $1,000 cash. And we'll, and it goes to my broker. We figure all that out. So like, there's ways people are getting creative. I think that's not taking off yet, but I could see a world in which like
Yeah.
someone looks at that and goes, that for me is what I want. I want this a la carte option. I'm going to go with this person.
Here's my theory for why that's not taking off, Nate, and you can tell me if I'm wrong because you got a lot more experience than I do. Is because so many first-time home buyers in today's market may go searching and actually not find something.
Mm,
I don't know if they're willing to incur the costs to be empty-handed at the end of it,
yeah.
right? Because the way the agreements are structured, with the 3% model, we got to get to the finish line before a fee is paid.
Yep.
And now I would argue if I'm an agent, I'm doing work. I could show somebody 10 homes, and if they come up empty-handed, like that's unfortunate, but I just spent a lot of time showing them 10 homes, and hopefully we're doing it well, and it takes an investment of time. So I can see both sides of the coin in the
For
story,
sure.
but I would guess in a different market than we're in, that might take off a little bit more. But I suspect many people might think about, hey, I could spend $1,000 going to see homes, and then actually don't ever end up getting one for whatever
Yeah. I mean,
reason. Maybe there isn't enough inventory, or they just change their mind, right?
no, I think you're right. I think that's probably right. I think that may start to shift if people change their mind, or if inventory changes, like you
Yeah.
said, or if it becomes more of a buyer's market. That may start to change. But you're right. You could go to 10 showings, put in 10 offers, and still get nothing,
Hmm.
because the housing market's crazy, and you're getting beat out on offers, right? So yeah, I totally see that.
We've talked a little bit about this, but I want to pick your brain some more. This to me adds a new layer of attention to detail that's needed. That I'm not sure if I think back to my first time home buyer self in 2009, come out of residency, like, give me the documents, I'm signing the papers, we're buying the home, right? I don't know how much I'm reading the details of it, but
Mm.
what's in this agreement now, I think is really important information, right? So what should people be looking for in terms of course, read it, but are there specific parts of these agreements or things that may vary from one agent, one broker to another that might help them determine what's a good fit?
There are a few, yeah. So the first one is to look for the actual compensation and how that's delivered, right? So, is it delivered at closing? Like, is it delivered? Even if you don't close on the house, like, so I've seen agreements out there, and we don't do this, but I've seen agreements out there where if you bring a willing and able buyer, and they back out for a non-contract reason, maybe we get to 5 days before closing, and you get cold feet, and you're just like, look, Nate, I can't, like, I can't.
Yeah.
It's too much. I'm done. They can have my earnest money. I don't care. There are contracts that are built. I've seen these out there where the agent still gets paid. Legally, they
Hmm.
should get a compensation of 3% or whatever for that deal, because they brought a willing and able buyer. They were ready to close on a house. The seller was ready to close,
Interesting.
and you screwed it up, right? So watch for language like that says how that payment is made and when, right? Super important. Also look for how you can get out of these agreements, right? So it's a lot of stress to say, hey, I want to agree to work with Nate or whoever for 6 months, let's say, under an agency agreement. Like, whoa, I'm not sure I'm ready to commit. How do I get out of that? So our standard language in our contract is that if you notify me within 72 hours, like, we're done. Only the houses that I showed you are we responsible for. So I can't like show you 123 Main Street. You write me a letter, say, Nate, we're done, and then you go to the seller directly, right? If I've showed you the house, we're together on that. But if you're like, Nate, it's not working out, like, this is how you can
Yeah.
walk away. So look for what that walk away language looks like, and make sure that you're comfortable with it. Um, so those are the big ones that I think can kind of trip people up. And then also look for the last piece is where that compensation is coming from. So again, the goal is to get it from the
Hmm.
seller, but it should be listed pretty explicitly in the contract that is the goal. the way our contract is written, it basically says like we are trying to get this from the goal is to make this a piece of the commission or the piece of the compensation from the seller. The goal is not to make the buyer just pay for it out of pocket. So I think that language is important to have in there just so you can make sure that the goals are aligned with what your goals are.
The time piece is really interesting, Nate, and I'm connecting some dots now. I had a conversation with a connection through one of my boys' baseball last summer that was bemoaning this must have been actually right after the implementation, probably late summer, early fall, was bemoaning this relationship he was in. I think he said a year. And it's just a really good example. The 72 hours, right, makes sense. Whatever you showed them, there should be an agreement and understanding for it, but there also should be an opportunity to change, relationship change. Maybe it's not a good fit. We thought it was a good fit, whatever might be the case.
Exactly.
And man, you don't want to be tied up long-term if you don't have to. So I don't know, maybe there will be some rules and stuff that come around that a while, but that to me seems really long, a year.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that typically what I'll see is, and you'll see this too for like listing agreements, right? So it's the same idea. And this has always been the case. This has been the case for years. If I list a home and I have 25 people that see it in a 6-month period, well, you can't end the listing agreement on January 1st and then on January 3rd accept an offer from one of the people that saw the house. I get like 6 months after that. Anybody that saw the house, if I can prove that they saw the house when I was the one that's trying to show it, then I'm due compensation. That's always been there. And so I think that's pretty similar. Hopefully that person wasn't actually locked up to that agent for a year. They were just locked to the listings they saw, but perhaps, I mean, that could be out there.
Oh yeah, that's true. That might've been it. Hopefully. He was not happy. I remember that.
I can imagine. That sounds awful.
So Nate, I'm a prospective home buyer listening. I want to be in this crazy market at some point, maybe in the spring or summer. When is a good time to be thinking about looking for an agent to begin that home buying search, that home buying journey?
Typically, I recommend 3 to 6 months before you think you're sort of ready to buy a house. Like if you can see yourself, if your lease is running out in June, January or February is your time to start talking with agents and start that process. Just to like kind of work backward, right? Like if you have a goal of like, hey, we want to be moved in by the fall for the school district, typically you're going to have a 30 to 40 day closing, right? So you got to work backward from that. And then you could have anywhere from a week to 5 months of looking for a house, right? It depends on your market and what the kind of averages are. So building in that 3 to 6 month window, make sure that you have a pretty good chance at getting everything done in time. Longer than that, if you're a year away, you're probably looking too early. Interest rates are going to change. The market's going to change. You're just going to be wasting you and your agent's time if you're looking at that stage. But that 3 to 6 month window tends to be kind of the sweet spot, based on my experience.
Yeah, Nate, as we've talked about before on this podcast and in other webinars, like a good real estate agent can be an important, not just team member, but the quarterback of the team, right? There's a lot of questions that can come in the home buying process, and that individual, especially with good experience, can help you navigate a lot of those. So we really believe this is one of the first pieces of the puzzle, if not the first piece of the puzzle that we have to put in place, which is a good segue in to talking about the real estate RPH concierge service. Many of our listeners, if they've heard the show before, know that we've had the opportunity to partner with you now 5 years, 6 years, 7 years.
Long time.
And we love what you have done to help pharmacists, home buyers all across the country. And you've actually had on a couple previous buyers that have worked with you on the show, and we'll link to those episodes in the show notes if people want to get a feel for what that is all about. Whether someone lives in Cleveland, in your backyard, in my backyard in Columbus, Tulsa, Oklahoma, you name it, across the country, the goal of the concierge service is to get them connected with a local agent that is a good fit, not only a good fit in that agent relationship with that buyer, but that also then has you in their corner and with them along the process throughout the home buying journey to help hold their hand. So tell us more about that concierge service, whether it's a first-time home buyer, second-time home buyer, investor. It applies across the board.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. The goal is to really take the guesswork out of this process, right? We're talking about all these interviews. We're talking about it. It's a lot of steps and a lot of things to figure out. And when I first did it, especially as a first-time home buyer, I had no idea what I was doing. Like, and I don't know if a 30-minute podcast is enough to like make me an expert on interviewing real estate agents, right? So we said, why don't we develop this service? It's completely free. It starts with a 30-minute phone call with me, where we're going to go through and answer any questions you have, figure out your goals, look at your budget, figure out where you want to buy, like what kind of property you want to buy, all those important questions, so we can narrow in on what is going to be the right agent fit for you. Then we'll go out and either connect you with one of our network agents, people we've worked with in the past that we've vetted, that we know have really good backgrounds and are working with clients right now. Either connect you with one of them, or we'll interview agents on your behalf until we can narrow down to somebody we think is a good fit. You move on, you work with that agent. You can either stick with them like we'd recommend, or if it's not a good fit, come back and we can, redo the process, right? That only happens a fraction of the time, but we're, you're not locked into anything. The goal here is to make this a great process. And so that's kind of how we build it. So completely free service. The idea being that it just takes the guesswork out for everybody.
So you can find more information on that, realestaterph.com. You can get to Nate's website, get connected with him. You can also send us an email at any time, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, and just say, connect me with Nate, and we'll help make that introduction as well. And, Nate, I'm thinking about the small percentage of people that are listening in Northeast Ohio, which obviously have you in their backyard. That's an easy win. But to clarify, again, it's really the intent is no matter where you live in the country, that Nate can be alongside of you to help you engage and find that agent, which, as we've outlined in this episode today, all the more important in evaluating agents, making sure that's a good fit in the context of the new buyer agreement. So again, realestaterph.com. You can get more information or send us an email, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com. Nate, as always, really appreciate your experience and the perspective you give. Thanks so much for coming on.
Steve, thanks for having me on the show.